last week, just as we began to count the 9 days that lead up to Tisha B'Av, the community in which I live in New Jersey suffered an incredibly heartbreaking loss. Rabbi Shmuel Berkowitz, one of the principals at the elementary school that my sons attend, and who was also the rabbi at a local synagogue, passed away. I can't even begin to count the number of people who benefited from his advice and guidance and support and encouragement and warmth. His students, the parents of his students, his congregants, people in the community. I shudder to think, and I wonder who's going to prop us up now and who's going to pick us up when we fall without Rabbi Berkowitz in our community. Which begs the question that unfortunately we have to ask ourselves every year on Tisha B'Av when we recount all the horrors that we've experienced as Jews throughout our history. How do we respond to tragedy? The Torah gives us some role models, of course. Aharon, Aaron, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, he sees that his eldest 2 sons have been killed by a fire from heaven. His younger brother Moshe, immediately consoles him, and the Torah tells us that Aaron was completely silent. He accepted the judgment from heaven. But there's a prior episode of a parent who suffered a similar loss who had a very different reaction. Jacob, Yaakov, the patriarch, gets the news that his son Yosef has been attacked and is presumed dead. And he cries out. He says, "That's my son's cloak. An evil beast has devoured him. My son Yosef has been torn apart." And he starts mourning. And he doesn't stop for 22 years until he's eventually reunited with Yosef, who, unbeknownst to him, was actually alive all that time down in Egypt. His family members repeatedly during those years try to console him, but he will not accept their consolation. And then there's a later example. King David HaMelech gets the news that notwithstanding his orders to spare his rebellious son Avshalom has been killed. And David HaMelech starts crying out over and over, "Avshalom B'ni, B'ni Avshalom, B'ni, my son Avshalom." So what's going on? Was the belief of Yaakov and David HaMelech and God on less secure footing than Aaron's? Why didn't they remain silent like Aaron did? And the answer is, of course they believed in God to the same degree. But each one of them understood that a different reaction was required given the circumstances. Aharon knew that the eyes of the nation were on him. He had to show them that the same fire that we're told 2 passages before had come down from heaven to inaugurate the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was the same fire that came down from heaven to take the lives of his sons. Good comes from God and bad comes from God, and we have to accept both and not question heaven. We have to show, and he had to show, his unwavering belief in God. Yaakov knew that the eyes of his sons were on him, and he knew that they were definitely somehow involved in the disappearance and apparent death of his son, their brother, their half-brother Yosef. And so he wanted to make them uncomfortable. That's why he wouldn't accept consolation during all those years. He wanted them to learn a lesson. He wanted them to repent, which they eventually did. And David HaMelech knew that even though his son had been rebellious, he needed his father at that moment in time. The Talmud tells us that after his death, because of his wicked deeds, Avshalom had been sent not just to Gehenna, to hell, but to the 7th level in Gehenna. Don't ask me what that means or where that is. I do not know, and I don't ever want to know. But David knew his son needed him, and only he could help at that point. So that sages of the Talmud explain that each time he cried out, "My son, B'ni," he was reaching down into Gehenna and lifting his son up level by level by level until the 8th time that he said, "My son," he was putting him in heaven. So how do we respond to tragedy? Maybe by imitating all 3 of them. Like Aaron, we have to remain silent. We cannot ask why. We cannot demand answers. If we do that, that's us hauling God down into our courtroom down here. We don't have the right to do that. Only he can haul us up there into his courtroom. And like Yaakov, we have to remain uncomfortable and not accept a full consolation. We have to recognize that we shouldn't go back to the way we were. We have to work on ourselves. We have to use tragedy as a prod for self-improvement. That's what the departed up in heaven would want. They'd want us to work on ourselves, take on some more commandments in their honor, not rail against what seems to be an unfair judgment. And like David HaMelech, we have to cry out. We have to empathize. We have to feel the pain of the survivors of those loved ones who passed away. We have to do whatever we can to help them out, the orphans, the widows. And hopefully by doing so, sometime soon, hopefully by next year on Tisha B'Av, instead of crying, we'll be able to dance.